February 17th, 1944. 35 miles west of Truck Atoll, Caroline Islands. Lieutenant Commander Tamekio Oda stood on the bridge of the destroyer Nowaki, watching the horizon through his binoculars as dawn broke over the Pacific. His ship, along with the light cruiser Katori and several other vessels, had departed Truk's protective lagoon hours earlier, fleeing the American carrier raid that had begun at first light. Behind them, the sky over the atoll glowed orange with burning ships and fuel stores. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate reports, but Oda's immediate concern was more concrete. His lookouts had spotted something on the horizon moving at impossible speed. Two massive silhouettes, larger than any Japanese warship, closing at 32 knots. At 09:45 hours, the sea erupted. 9 shells, each weighing 1 ton, crossed 20 miles of ocean in less than a minute. The first salvo from USS Iowa fell short. The second straddled Nowaki perfectly, one shell splashing to port, another to starboard, close enough that Oda felt the concussion through his deck plating. The American battleships were firing at a range that exceeded every assumption in Japanese naval doctrine. More troubling still, they were firing with an accuracy that should have been impossible at such distance. No optical rangefinder could provide that precision. Oda ordered maximum speed and began violent evasive maneuvers, zigzagging into the sun's glare. Behind him, Katori was not so fortunate. The Iowa's sister ship, New Jersey, found her range within minutes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Oda could not have known as Nowaki fled northeast at 35 knots was that he had just encountered the future of naval warfare. The shells pursuing his destroyer were not guided by human eyes straining through stereoscopic rangefinders, but by electromagnetic pulses bouncing off his hull from 66 feet above the waterline. The Americans had deployed Mark 13 fire control radar, an invisible hand reaching across the horizon, calculating range, bearing, and rate of change with mechanical precision. Every 12 seconds, Nowaki's position was measured, transmitted to fire control computers below deck, and translated into targeting solutions for guns that could independently adjust their elevation to the fraction of a degree. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. Nowaki escaped, damaged by splinters from near misses but afloat. Katori did not. Neither did the destroyer Maikaze or the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru. When Oda's after-action report reached Combined Fleet Headquarters at Kure, it included observations that troubled senior officers far more than the loss of 3 ships. The American battleships had fired 40 rounds at Nowaki from ranges between 35,000 and 39,000 yards. In conditions where Japanese fire control doctrine considered accurate gunnery impossible, the Americans had placed shells consistently within 200 yards of a destroyer, moving at maximum speed and maneuvering radically. The implications were clear to anyone willing to confront them. The Americans possessed technology that rendered distance itself meaningless. This was not the war Japan had prepared to fight. This was not the enemy Japan had studied during 2 decades of naval competition. Something fundamental had changed in the mathematics of sea combat, and that change carried consequences that extended far beyond the loss of ships at Truk. Lieutenant Commander Oda would survive the war. Nowaki would not, sunk 7 months later at Leyte Gulf. But the report Oda filed in February 1944 became part of a growing archive of encounters that documented a technological asymmetry so pronounced that it would reshape Japanese naval thinking entirely. The battleships that had chased Nowaki were not experimental vessels or one-off prototypes. They were the first of 4 identical ships, with 2 more under construction. Each carried 9 16-inch guns of a type Japan had never encountered in combat, guns that could fire shells weighing 2,700 pounds, with muzzle velocities approaching 2,600 feet per second. More critically, each ship carried integrated fire control systems that transformed those guns from mechanical artillery pieces into precision instruments capable of engaging targets at ranges where traditional optical fire control became ineffective. The Mark 38 gunfire control system, paired with Mark 8 fire control radar, created a closed loop between detection and destruction that operated faster than human reaction time could manage. By the time a Japanese gunner observed the splash of an incoming salvo, American fire control computers had already calculated corrections and transmitted them to the turrets. The technological gap was not incremental, it was categorical. And it had been growing, largely invisible to Japanese naval planners, since the late 1930s. The war Japan entered in December 1941 was a war its naval leadership believed it could win through superior ship design, superior crew training, and superior tactical doctrine. The combined fleet that struck Pearl Harbor represented the culmination of 20 years of naval construction under treaty limitations and 10 years of unrestricted building after Japan abandoned those treaties in 1936. The battleship Yamato, commissioned 8 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, embodied Japanese naval philosophy perfectly. She displaced 72,000 tons at full load. Her armor belt measured 16 inches at its thickest point, with deck armor reaching 9 inches over her magazines. Most importantly, she mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever installed on a warship. Each of Yamato's guns weighed 147 tons and could fire a shell weighing 3,200 pounds to a range of 45,000 yards, approximately 26 miles. The shells themselves represented sophisticated metallurgical achievement, designed to penetrate the deck armor of American battleships through plunging fire at extreme range. Yamato's fire control system incorporated the Type 94 director, which used optical rangefinders measuring 46 feet in length. These instruments, among the finest optical systems in any navy, could determine range with accuracy measured in yards at distances exceeding 40,000 yards. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through 2 decades of study and wargaming at the Naval Staff College in Tokyo, anticipated engaging American battleships at ranges between 20,000 and 30,000 yards. At these distances, Yamato's superior gun caliber would allow her to penetrate American armor while remaining immune to American shells. Japanese gunners trained extensively in long-range fire, practicing techniques for spotting fall of shot and making corrections based on optical observation. The entire system rested on assumptions about the relationship between gun size, armor thickness, and engagement range that had governed capital ship design since the Dreadnought Revolution of 1906. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They were based on extensive analysis of naval engagements dating back to Tsushima in 1905, informed by Japanese observers at Jutland in 1916, and validated by Japan's own combat experience in the Sino-Japanese War. Japanese fire control methodology, while relying on optical instruments rather than electronics, had proven effective in practice. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, Japanese cruisers had accurately engaged Allied vessels at ranges exceeding 25,000 yards. The battle that sank HMAS Perth and USS Houston demonstrated that Japanese optical fire control, when properly employed, could achieve results comparable to any navy afloat. But the Java Sea battle had been fought at night, in confused conditions, with limited maneuvering space. It had not involved American battleships. It had not involved the integrated radar fire control systems that the United States had been developing, testing, and refining since 1937. By February 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Oda encountered Iowa and New Jersey off Truk, the United States Navy had installed Mark III or Mark VIII fire control radar on every capital ship in the Pacific Fleet. These systems operated independently of visual conditions, unaffected by smoke, haze, darkness, or sun glare. They measured range continuously, updated targeting solutions in real time, and allowed American gunners to maintain fire even when their targets were entirely invisible to the human eye. The Mark VIII radar transmitted pulses at 10 centimeters wavelength, with peak power of 50 kilowatts. Its effective range exceeded 45,000 yards. More importantly, its range accuracy was measured in yards rather than the hundreds of yards typical of optical rangefinders at extreme distance. This precision fed into mechanical fire control computers that could calculate ballistic solutions, accounting for wind, temperature, deck roll, and target motion transformed gunnery from an art into a science. The result was the engagement Oda experienced. American battleships, firing at ranges where Japanese doctrine considered aimed fire impossible, placing shells with sufficient accuracy to straddle a small, fast-moving target. Not once, but repeatedly, maintaining fire even as the target maneuvered radically and disappeared into the sun. The American technological advantage extended beyond radar. The Iowa-class battleships incorporated fire control systems that integrated information from multiple sources simultaneously. Radar provided range and bearing. Stable vertical gyroscopes compensated for ship motion. Mechanical computers, weighing tons and incorporating hundreds of gears and cams, calculated solutions that accounted for variables, including propellant temperature, barrel wear, ammunition lot variations, and even the rotation of the Earth. Turret officers did not aim their guns. They confirmed that the guns were pointed where the fire control system indicated they should be pointed, then opened fire when the system indicated optimal firing conditions had been achieved. This integration created capabilities that surpassed the sum of individual components. During trials in Chesapeake Bay in 1943, Iowa had demonstrated the ability to maintain accurate fire while maneuvering at speeds exceeding 30 knots. Her guns remained on target even as the ship heeled through turns, her fire control system automatically compensating for the angle of deck. In one exercise, Iowa placed 3 consecutive salvos within a 100-yard square at a range of 26,000 yards while steaming at maximum speed. No Japanese battleship could match that performance, not because Japanese ships were poorly designed or Japanese gunners inadequately trained, but because Japan had not developed the fire control technology that made such accuracy possible. The technology gap had emerged gradually, the product of different industrial philosophies and different research priorities. American fire control development traced its lineage to the work of civilian scientists at Bell Telephone Laboratories and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. These researchers approached gunnery as an electrical engineering problem, susceptible to solution through servo mechanisms, vacuum tubes, and eventually radar. Japanese fire control development remained rooted in mechanical engineering and optical science, fields where Japan possessed considerable expertise, but which offered limited paths toward fundamental breakthrough. The divergence began before the war. In 1937, the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory successfully demonstrated pulse radar capable of detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. By 1939, researchers at Bell Labs had developed fire control radar prototypes. By 1941, such systems were being installed on new construction warships. Japan's radar development program, hampered by inter-service rivalry between Army and Navy research establishments, and by limited access to high-frequency electronics components, lagged years behind. Japanese ships carried radar by 1942, but these were detection sets only, incapable of the precision ranging required for fire control. The implications extended beyond individual ship capability. American radar allowed task force commanders to coordinate defensive fire across multiple vessels, creating overlapping fields of engagement that Japanese attackers could not penetrate. During the Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, American radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and fighter direction contributed to the destruction of more than 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. Japanese pilots, trained to expect visual detection at close range, found themselves intercepted at distances that seemed impossible, engaged by gunfire before they could identify targets, directed by radio communications they could not understand. By mid-1944, this pattern of technological surprise had become routine. Japanese airmen reported being tracked and engaged by American fighters while still beyond visual range. Japanese submarine commanders described being depth-charged with uncanny accuracy in conditions of zero visibility. Japanese surface units encountered American warships that opened fire at ranges where no visual sighting should have been possible. Each report added to an accumulation of evidence that pointed toward an uncomfortable conclusion. The Americans possessed capabilities that Japan could not counter with existing doctrine or equipment. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war confident in its technical competence, its tactical sophistication, and its fighting spirit. Personnel at all levels believed that Japanese equipment, particularly optical instruments and torpedoes, represented the finest in the world. Officers who had observed American industrial methods during pre-war visits noted American emphasis on mass production and standardization, but generally concluded that American equipment, while abundant, lacked the precision craftsmanship of Japanese manufacture. The encounter with American radar-directed fire control shattered these comfortable assumptions. Lieutenant Commander Oda's report from the Truk engagement circulated among staff officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters. It was read by commanders preparing for the Philippine Sea operation. It informed discussions about how to employ Yamato and her sister ship Musashi in future surface engagements. But reading the report and understanding its implications were different matters. To truly comprehend what American radar fire control meant required accepting that Japanese naval supremacy, premised on superior ship design and crew quality, rested on foundations that technology had rendered obsolete. Some officers grasped this immediately. Others required multiple encounters before the pattern became undeniable. All would eventually reach the same conclusion, though by different paths and at different times. The ocean that Japan had controlled through the superiority of its combined fleet was becoming an American domain through the superiority of American electronics, American industry, and American scientific research. The battleships that had seemed invincible when commissioned, the tactics that had been perfected through 2 decades of study, the assumptions about naval warfare that had governed Japanese planning since the Washington Naval Treaty, all were revealed as inadequate when confronted by an enemy who fought with technologies Japan had never anticipated developing. The technological asymmetry that Lieutenant Commander Oda encountered off Truk was not accidental. It was the product of systematic American investment in fire control technology that had begun in the interwar period and accelerated dramatically after 1939. Understanding the magnitude of Japan's disadvantage requires examining the specific systems that made American naval gunnery so devastatingly effective. The Mark 38 gun fire control system, installed aboard Iowa-class battleships, represented the pinnacle of American fire control development. The system's core was the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, a mechanical analog computer weighing approximately 2,800 pounds and containing more than 3,000 parts. This device received inputs from radar, optical rangefinders, ship's gyroscopes, and speed indicators. It calculated firing solutions by mechanically solving differential equations, accounting for target range, bearing, speed, and course, along with ballistic variables including projectile weight, muzzle velocity, air density, wind velocity, and even the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. The Mark 8 radar that fed range data to this system operated at 3,300 MHz, with a pulse width of 2 microseconds. Its parabolic antenna, measuring 6 feet in diameter, rotated continuously while mounted 66 feet above the waterline for maximum detection range. The system could track targets simultaneously while continuing to search for new contacts. Range accuracy was measured in 15-yard increments at 30,000 yards, a precision impossible to achieve with optical instruments at such vivid distances. This integration meant that Iowa could engage targets under conditions where Japanese ships remained effectively blind. During the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, American battleships opened fire on Japanese vessels at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in darkness so complete that Japanese optical rangefinders were useless. The engagement lasted 42 minutes. 5 of the 7 Japanese ships attempting to transit the strait were sunk or crippled. American fire control radar had transformed night combat from a confused melee into a methodical execution. The disparity extended to ammunition. Iowa's 16-inch Mark 8 armor-piercing shells weighed 2,700 pounds and were propelled by 660 pounds of smokeless powder contained in silk bags. These projectiles could penetrate 16 inches of face-hardened armor at 20,000 yards. More significantly, American manufacturing tolerances ensured consistency across batches. Shell weights varied by less than 5 pounds from specification. This uniformity allowed fire control computers to make accurate predictions without needing to account for significant ammunition variations. Japanese 18.1-inch Type 91 armor-piercing shells theoretically offered superior penetration, but inconsistent manufacturing quality meant actual performance varied considerably. Propellant charges showed similar variation, complicating range prediction. Without radar to provide immediate feedback on shot placement, Japanese gunners relied on optical spotting of splashes, a process that took minutes and became nearly impossible at extreme ranges or in poor visibility. The crew composition revealed another critical difference. Iowa's fire control party included specialized ratings that did not exist in the Japanese Navy. Fire control technicians maintained and calibrated the radar systems. Gunners' mates operated the range keepers. Plot room personnel tracked multiple targets simultaneously using plotting boards that integrated information from across the ship. These specialists trained for months on their specific equipment before ever deploying operationally. Japanese battleship crews, while disciplined and courageous, lacked equivalent specialization in electronic fire control because such systems largely did not exist. Optical rangefinder operators received extensive training, but their equipment, however precisely manufactured, could not overcome the fundamental limitations of human visual acuity at extended ranges. Japanese Type 94 directors could theoretically determine range at 40,000 yards, but practical accuracy degraded rapidly beyond 30,000 yards, particularly in anything other than ideal atmospheric conditions. By February 1944, this technological gap had crystallized into operational reality. American battleships could detect, track, and engage targets at ranges and under conditions where Japanese vessels could not effectively return fire. The battle was decided before the first shot was fired, determined not by courage or training but by the electromagnetic spectrum and the mathematics of ballistic computation. The moment of absolute comprehension came not at Truk, but 6 months later, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. Captain Toshio Abe commanded the battleship Nagato, flagship of Battleship Division 2, positioned in the center of Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. Throughout the morning, Abe had monitored increasingly desperate radio transmissions from Japanese carrier aircraft attempting to strike the American invasion force at Saipan. The pattern was consistent and troubling. Strike groups reported being intercepted by American fighters while still 70 to 80 miles from their targets. Those that penetrated the fighter screen encountered anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented accuracy and volume. At 1300 hours, Nagato's radio room intercepted an unencrypted American fighter direction transmission. The voice was calm, methodical, speaking in clear English that Nagato's English-speaking communications officer could easily translate. The American controller was vectoring fighters to intercept a Japanese strike group, providing bearings, distances, and altitudes with precision that suggested radar guidance. The intercept occurred 65 miles from the American carriers. No visual sighting should have been possible at such range. Abe consulted with his staff. The implications were clear but required articulation. The Americans were not simply detecting incoming strikes early through lucky patrol placement. They possessed systematic electronic detection capabilities that provided continuous tracking across distances that exceeded visual range by an order of magnitude. They were directing their fighters to intercepts using this information, creating a defensive zone that Japanese aircraft could not penetrate without suffering catastrophic losses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 1430 hours, the evidence had become overwhelming. Radio intercepts indicated that 3 separate Japanese strike waves, totaling over 300 aircraft, had been decimated before reaching their targets. Fewer than 30 planes had actually attacked American ships. Fewer than 10 had scored hits. Approximately 200 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Americans, according to the intercepts Nagato's radio room continued to monitor, had lost fewer than 30 fighters. Abe reviewed the engagement map his staff had compiled from radio reports and radar contacts. The pattern was undeniable. Japanese aircraft had been detected at ranges exceeding 80 miles. American fighters had intercepted them at ranges between 50 and 70 miles. Those aircraft that penetrated to within 30 miles of the American task force encountered coordinated anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships, firing not in barrage patterns but with aimed precision, suggesting radar direction. The technological asymmetry that Lieutenant Commander Oda had encountered off Truk in February had now revealed its full strategic implications. American radar did not simply make individual ships more effective. It transformed the entire defensive envelope around American task forces, creating layered defense zones that extended from beyond visual range to point-blank range, each layer guided by electronic detection and direction systems that Japanese forces could neither match nor counter. At 1700 hours, Admiral Ozawa transmitted orders for the mobile fleet to withdraw to the northwest. The carrier strike capability that was supposed to provide the decisive blow against the American invasion force had been destroyed in a single day of operations. Nagato had not fired her guns. Neither had any Japanese battleship. The engagement had been decided by technologies that made traditional surface combat irrelevant. That evening, Captain Abe drafted his assessment for Battleship Division headquarters. His conclusion was direct and unequivocal. Japanese naval forces could not operate effectively within range of American radar coverage. The Americans possessed detection and fire control capabilities that exceeded Japanese systems by margins that could not be overcome through tactical excellence, superior training, or fighting spirit. The fundamental assumptions that had governed Japanese naval planning since the Washington Naval Treaty had been rendered obsolete. Without equivalent electronic warfare capabilities, the combined fleet could not contest American control of the Pacific operating areas. The report reached Tokyo within 48 hours. It was read by senior officers at Naval General Staff. It was filed, with dozens of similar assessments from other commands. But acknowledging technological inferiority and accepting its strategic implications remained psychologically difficult for officers who had devoted careers to perfecting a doctrine that technology had superseded. The final disillusionment came not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through accumulated encounters that made denial impossible. By October 1944, Japanese naval officers at all levels possessed direct, personal experience with American technological superiority. The evidence was no longer statistical or abstract. It was visceral, immediate, and undeniable. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force encountered American escort carriers off Samar on October 25. Kurita commanded the most powerful surface force Japan had assembled since Midway, including the super battleship Yamato. His targets were 6 escort carriers protected by destroyers and destroyer escorts. By every traditional calculation, the engagement should have resulted in the swift destruction of the American force. Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers possessed overwhelming firepower advantage against vessels designed for anti-submarine patrol, not fleet engagement. Yet the battle devolved into confusion almost immediately. American destroyers launched torpedo attacks while generating smoke screens. American aircraft, though few in number and poorly armed for anti-ship work, conducted continuous harassment strikes. Most critically, American vessels employed radar guidance to maintain coordinated maneuvers in conditions where Japanese optical fire control became increasingly ineffective. Yamato fired her 18-inch guns at American carriers at ranges between 20,000 and 35,000 yards. She achieved no hits. Her fire control, dependent on optical range finding and visual spotting of fall of shot, could not maintain accuracy against small, fast-moving targets generating smoke and maneuvering radically. When American destroyers closed to launch torpedoes, Yamato's secondary battery engaged them with guns optically directed. The Americans used their radar to navigate through smoke that completely obscured them from Japanese gunners while maintaining accurate torpedo firing positions. After 2.5 hours of action, Kurita withdrew. His force had sunk 1 escort carrier and several smaller vessels, but had failed to destroy the American escort carrier group and had not reached the vulnerable amphibious forces in Leyte Gulf. More significantly, several Japanese heavy cruisers had been sunk or severely damaged by a combination of air attacks and torpedo strikes from destroyers that had maintained offensive effectiveness despite catastrophic damage. The after-action reports compiled by surviving ships documented the technological gap with brutal specificity. Japanese optical fire control had proven inadequate for engaging small, maneuvering targets at extended range, particularly in conditions of reduced visibility. American vessels had demonstrated ability to navigate, maneuver, and attack effectively while completely obscured by smoke, suggesting radar-assisted navigation and fire control. Japanese anti-aircraft fire had failed to prevent American air attacks despite local air superiority, while American anti-aircraft fire, though coming from much smaller vessels with lighter armament, had proven surprisingly effective. The statistical evidence supported these qualitative observations. American industrial production figures, which Japanese intelligence had tracked throughout the war, revealed a disparity that made prolonged conflict mathematically unwinnable. In 1944 alone, the United States had launched 68 escort carriers, dozens of fleet carriers, and hundreds of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Japanese naval construction had managed 5 escort carriers and fewer than 30 destroyers. The ratio was not improving, it was deteriorating. By November 1944, these realities had penetrated even the most optimistic assessments. The combined fleet, which had begun the war as one of the world's most powerful naval forces, had been reduced to scattered remnants operating defensively from fortified positions. American forces operated with impunity throughout the Western Pacific, supported by logistics networks that supplied fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities Japan could not match. American task forces included escort carriers whose sole purpose was providing replacement aircraft and pilots to fleet carriers, a redundancy Japan could never afford. The collision between Japanese expectations and material reality was complete. The war Japan had planned to fight through superior ship design and warrior spirit had become a war of industrial production and technological innovation. Japan possessed neither the industrial capacity nor the scientific infrastructure to compete in this contest. The recognition of this truth marked not just military defeat, but the collapse of assumptions that had governed Japanese naval thinking for 2 decades. The months following Leyte Gulf marked the final dissolution of Japanese naval power as an operational force. The combined fleet, which had begun the war with 10 battleships, 11 fleet carriers, and over 200 destroyers, had been reduced to scattered vessels operating from increasingly isolated bases. But the material losses, however catastrophic, represented only the visible dimension of defeat. The psychological cost, the recognition that fundamental assumptions had been wrong, carried consequences that extended beyond tactical adjustments. Lieutenant Commander Oda, whose February 1944 encounter with Iowa and New Jersey off Truk had provided early warning of American radar fire control capabilities, did not survive to see the war's conclusion. Nowaki was sunk at the Battle off Cape Engano on October 25, 1944. Destroyed by aircraft from USS Essex and USS Lexington. The destroyer went down with most of her crew, including Oda, who had been promoted to executive officer following the Truk engagement. His after-action report, filed 8 months earlier, remained in combined fleet archives, one document among hundreds that had chronicled the technological asymmetry but could not reverse it. Captain Toshio Abe, who had commanded Nagato during the Philippine Sea Battle, survived. Nagato herself remained afloat until July 1946, when she was expended as a target vessel during Operation Crossroads atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Abe's detailed assessment of American radar capabilities, written in June 1944, had circulated among senior staff officers, but had arrived too late to influence strategic planning. By the time his report reached decision-makers, the outcome it predicted had already become inevitable. The super battleship Yamato met her end on April 7, 1945, during Operation Tengo, a one-way sortie against American forces invading Okinawa. The operation was conceived as a suicide mission from inception. Yamato departed Tokuyama with fuel sufficient only for the outbound journey, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. The force was detected by American submarines while still in the inland sea. American carrier aircraft intercepted the formation 200 miles southwest of Kyushu, beyond range of land-based air cover. The engagement lasted 2 hours. Yamato absorbed an estimated 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb hits. She capsized and exploded at 14:23 hours, taking 2,500 crewmen with her. American losses totaled 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. The disparity summarized 3.5 years of Pacific War experience. Japanese surface vessels, however powerful, could not operate effectively within range of American carrier aircraft. American radar had provided continuous tracking of Yamato's force from departure to destruction, allowing perfect coordination of the strike that sank her. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had commanded Center Force at Leyte Gulf, survived the war and spent subsequent decades defending his decision to withdraw from Samar rather than press the attack against the escort carriers. His memoirs, published in the 1960s, acknowledged the technological disparity, but emphasized that courage and determination remained relevant even against superior equipment. This tension between accepting material inferiority and maintaining institutional dignity characterized much of post-war Japanese naval historical writing. The officers who had encountered American radar fire control firsthand, who had experienced the disorientation of being engaged at ranges where visual acquisition was impossible, who had watched optical fire control systems fail against targets that maneuvered using electronic guidance, understood the implications at a visceral level that staff analyses could not capture. They had confronted the gap between doctrine and reality, between expectation and evidence, between the Navy they had been trained to serve and the technological environment in which they actually fought. For these men, the aftermath was not simply military defeat, but philosophical crisis. The hierarchical system that had shaped their careers, the emphasis on spiritual strength over material advantage, the confidence in Japanese technical excellence, all had been proven inadequate when tested against an enemy who approached warfare as an engineering problem susceptible to technological solution. The technological asymmetry that destroyed Japanese naval power at Truk, Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf represented more than tactical defeat. It marked the emergence of a new paradigm in naval warfare, where electronic systems and industrial capacity mattered more than individual ship characteristics or crew quality. The implications extended far beyond the Pacific War, fundamentally reshaping how modern navies would be designed, equipped, and employed. The Iowa-class battleships that had demonstrated this transformation so decisively off Truk continued in service for decades after World War II ended. USS Iowa herself was decommissioned in 1949, reactivated for Korean War service in 1951, decommissioned again in 1958, reactivated during the Reagan administration in 1984, and finally retired in 1990. Across 4 decades of intermittent service, Iowa fired her guns in anger at Truk in 1944, at shore targets in Korea in the 1950s, and at Lebanese positions in 1983. Her fire control systems were continuously upgraded, replacing mechanical computers with digital systems, but the fundamental architecture remained consistent: electronic detection, automated calculation, precision engagement. USS New Jersey, Iowa's sister ship and Oda's other pursuer off Truk, saw similar extended service. She provided gunfire support during the Vietnam War, when her 16-inch guns could deliver 2,700-pound shells with accuracy that precision-guided munitions would not match until decades later. The radar fire control systems that had devastated Japanese destroyers in 1944 proved equally effective against shore installations in 1968, demonstrating the enduring value of the technological approach American engineers had pioneered. The lessons Japanese naval officers learned through bitter experience informed post-war Japanese self-defense force development. The Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in 1954, emphasized electronic warfare capabilities from inception. Japanese destroyers and frigates incorporated radar and sonar systems that reflect understanding that modern naval combat occurred across the electromagnetic spectrum as much as across physical ocean space. The cultural emphasis on optical precision and mechanical craftsmanship that had characterized pre-war Japanese naval construction gave way to recognition that electronics and systems integration determined combat effectiveness. This transformation was neither immediate nor psychologically painless. Senior officers who had served in the Imperial Navy and survived to influence self-defense force development struggled to reconcile their wartime experience with institutional narratives about Japanese technical competence and warrior spirit. The acknowledgement that American technology, not American courage, had determined the Pacific War's outcome challenged foundational assumptions about what made navies effective. The broader strategic legacy extended to naval development worldwide. Every major navy that emerged from World War II incorporated radar fire control as fundamental rather than supplementary capability. The British Royal Navy, which had developed its own radar systems in parallel with American efforts, standardized radar-directed gunnery across all major vessels. The Soviet Navy, reconstructing after catastrophic losses during the Great Patriotic War, prioritized radar and electronics in new construction, despite limited access to Western technology. Even navies of smaller nations that could not afford sophisticated electronics recognized that modern naval combat required capabilities Japan had lacked. The battleship itself, as a ship type, became obsolete within a decade of the war's end, not because battleship guns lacked utility, but because the combination of carrier aviation and guided missiles provided strike capabilities that made heavily armored gun platforms inefficient investments. The Iowa class, remarkably, survived this transition precisely because their fire control systems were sophisticated enough to integrate newer weapons. When New Jersey was reactivated in the 1980s, she carried Tomahawk cruise missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles alongside her 16-inch guns. The electronic infrastructure that had made her guns devastating in 1944 adapted to guide missiles in 1984. The technological gap that Lieutenant Commander Oda had encountered off Truk, that Captain Abe had documented at Philippine Sea, that Vice Admiral Kurita had experienced at Samar, thus represented not merely Japanese defeat, but a fundamental shift in how naval power would be measured and employed for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Return now to Lieutenant Commander Tamekio Oda on the bridge of Nowaki, February 17, 1944, 35 miles west of Truk Atoll. The shells falling around his destroyer, each weighing a ton, crossing 20 miles of ocean in less than 60 seconds, pursuing his ship with mechanical precision despite radical evasive maneuvers. In that 17-minute engagement, Oda encountered the future. He did not fully comprehend it. How could he? The technology pursuing him was invisible, incomprehensible within the framework of naval doctrine he had been taught, but he recognized that something fundamental had changed. His report, filed upon return to base, conveyed this recognition even if it could not articulate the full implications. American battleships were firing with accuracy that should have been impossible at such range. The engagement parameters exceeded every assumption in Japanese doctrine. Something beyond superior training or ship design was at work. That something was the systematic application of scientific research to military problems, the integration of electronics with mechanical systems, the transformation of gunnery from art to engineering. It was the product of choices American military planners had made in the late 1930s, investments in radar research and fire control development that would not show dividends until years later. It was the result of industrial capacity that could produce sophisticated electronic systems in quantities sufficient to equip every major warship. It was the manifestation of a different approach to technological development, one that emphasized systems integration and electrical engineering over mechanical precision and optical excellence. The Japanese Navy that Oda served had not been negligent or incompetent. It had been systematic, disciplined, and sophisticated in its approach to naval warfare. Japanese naval architects had designed remarkable ships. Japanese opticians had created rangefinders of extraordinary precision. Japanese torpedo designers had developed weapons that remained unmatched throughout the war. But excellence in these domains could not compensate for absence in another. Radar, fire control computing, and electronics integration represented capabilities that Japan had not prioritized and could not rapidly develop once their importance became apparent. The cost of this gap was measured in ships sunk, aircraft destroyed, and lives lost. Nowaki, Katori, Yamato, Musashi, and hundreds of other vessels went to the bottom. Oda and thousands of his fellow officers died without seeing their nations surrender. But the deeper cost was psychological, the recognition that assumptions held for decades had been wrong, that confidence in Japanese technical superiority had been misplaced, that material reality could not be overcome through spiritual strength or tactical brilliance. This recognition, painful as it was, carried value. Post-war Japanese technological development reflected lessons learned from this defeat. The nation that had approached naval gunnery as a problem of optical precision and mechanical craftsmanship became a leader in electronics, semiconductor manufacturing, and systems integration. The emphasis on technical excellence remained, but the definition of what constituted technical excellence shifted to accommodate the reality that modern warfare was fought across multiple domains simultaneously, that electronic capabilities mattered as much as physical hardware, that systems integration determined effectiveness as much as individual component quality. The shells that pursued Nowaki across the Pacific in February 1944 carried a message that would take months to fully comprehend and years to properly address. American radar fire control was not simply a superior technology. It was a different category of capability, one that required different industrial infrastructure, different research priorities, and different institutional assumptions about what made military forces effective. Japan learned this lesson through defeat. The learning was costly, painful, and irreversible. But it was, ultimately, true. And truth, however costly, retains value. The officers who encountered American radar fire control, who filed reports documenting capabilities they could not counter, who watched doctrine fail when tested against reality, served their nation by acknowledging what existed rather than defending what they wished existed. Their honest reporting, their willingness to document technological inferiority despite institutional pressures toward optimism, provided foundation for the transformation that would follow defeat. In this limited but significant sense, the cost of truth yielded returns, though measured in decades rather than days, in institutional transformation rather than tactical victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.